سكيد خون عتي كيد خما يا كيد خون أبراخي كيد لما سنافقك بيته ناي عقدو قسانا سنافقك بيته ناي هدمو قزانا يركب الكدخون عطمون جيزي سرز خبرلو فتحي مسنقسي حسب ما كرتته معرف مسكتمي ما ينقسم الزخرة زخروك حساسي جزانا 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 ما عرفت نبين ايش تعلمي جزانا 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 ما عرفت لبين ايش تعلمي ما قادنا ايش توقن برقة وعابي سبيب مدربيت قفيح بفغري عم يغندك سعزيفنا مدري ما مو كزانا لإيش تعلمنا مس في شخص دينا أبفرنا كجانا بيتنا نزر زهوتنا مستفانة صحايت ولد وقحتا بيتيك ملسيو صلاتي مهللاي كزي زي حسسو رحكي زي كولو نفوغوت صدراي سكي قزاوتي أباقي تريفو لوام دكاسي أباقي تريفو بحقاي حلمتاتي
Thank you for the great welcome song, Girmay. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Bon après-midi à tout le monde. Assalamu alaikum. Salam. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this inaugural seminar series on decolonizing forced migration, political intelligibility, reflexivity, and epistemological agency. These seminar series are organized by postgraduate researchers from the University of Leeds and the University of Glasgow. My name is Khaira Arroush. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds, School of Sociology and Social Policy. I'm working on the immobilities of sub-Saharan migrants in Algeria. And you may have noticed from the Eventbrite link the picture that depicts sub-Saharan migrants in one of the Algerian cities, Oran, who are either stuck there or in transit or continue to risk their lives in dangerous journeys, presenting a typical situation for involuntary displacement. The immobilities of people from the global south to the global north have gained scholarly and political attention, fueled negative media reports, policy, new restrictive policies, and Eurocentric scholarship. These narratives and modes of knowledge productions continue to prevail and spread sociopolitical, epistemic, and representational inequalities with the goal of unsettling this dominant narrative and decolonizing the Eurocentric ecologies of knowledge productions. These seminar series aim to promote critical thinking and creative ways of unpacking the epistemic fault lines in the production and circulation of knowledge on forced migration, at the same time highlight the often muted voices of forced migrants. These seminar series also aim to discuss how the precarious states of being of the displaced migrant are represented in the political life. We hope that these seminars also bring to the fore migrants' voices, cultures, stories, ways of knowing and unknowing at the same time, and more importantly, their struggles. The inaugural talk of today will be delivered by Professor Alison Phipps on the theme of integration. Why integration is a delicate art that needs everyone's language. So on behalf of co-organizers, I would like to welcome you all again with us. And I hope this seminar series could be a good opportunity for all of us to engage critically on the themes under discussion. Before I invite Hiab to briefly introduce the organizers, I would like also to thank our supervisors, Professor Adrian Faval, Dr. Roxana Barbelisco, and Professor Alison Phipps for all the support and guidance. Thank you so much. I hope you will enjoy the seminar. Yep, would you like to take the lead?
Yeah, thank you, Hera. And also thank you, Gurmai, for the great welcome song. And I welcome again everyone to our lecture, our first lecture by Alison Phipps, Professor Alison Phipps. It's amazing to see so many experts and professionals attending the event. My name is Hiab Johannes, originally Eritrean and currently a refugee in the UK. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow and a holder of the UNESCO Ryla Scholarship. I co-organize this PhD led. I am also a refugee in the UK. Let me now briefly introduce you to the other organizers. Khaira, who just spoke to you about the seminar series, is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Leeds School of Sociology and Social Policy. Hi, Khaira. And Tesfa Alem Yemane. Tesfa Alem, can you have your hand, please? Tesfa Alem Yemane is a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds School of Sociology and Social Policy. He's an Eritrean refugee in the UK as well. And Suad, can you? Yeah, Suad is a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds again, School of Languages, Cultures and Societies. And Girmay, can I? Yeah. He's an Eritrean songwriter, singer and composer. He is multilingual. He speaks English, Arabic, Tigrinya, and other Eritrean local languages as well. It's also a great pleasure to introduce you to Bella and Lauren, who have done all the work of setting up the event, bright registration and promotions. Both Laura and Bella are coordinators at the UNESCO chair at the University of Glasgow School of Education. Bella, can you wave your hand, please? And Lauren. Thank you both. Now let me turn to some housekeeping notes. I promise there are no fire exit rules to tell you, but please follow all the basic health and safety measures in where you are. Also, can I please ask all of us, with the exception of the organizers and our speakers, to mute or to keep your microphones muted so that we do not interrupt the speaker. Also, I just wanted to remind you we are video recording this session. So if you do not want yourself to be recorded, please switch off your cameras and listen to the lecture. You can also change your names as well. I believe you will have referred to the university data protection guidelines and Zoom terms and condition references highlighted in the event registration link regarding data protection. Lastly, about the proceeding of the talk, Professor Alison Phipps will speak roughly for about 40 minutes, and we will have 20 minutes for questions and answer afterwards. There are two ways to ask questions. One, you can put your questions using the Zoom chat function. So Bella and Lauren will help us read the questions to Professor Alison Phipps. And two, raise your hands using the raise hand feature of the Zoom. You need to click the participants function to find the raise hand option. I will then invite you to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly to Professor Alison Phipps. Also, please do not hesitate to leave comments and feedbacks through the chat box. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Tesfalem to introduce Professor Alison Phipps. Tesfalem.
Thank you, Hiyab. What a great pleasure an honor to introduce Professor Alison to today's inaugural seminar. So, as it has been said, Professor Alison will be talking on integration, which I am very passionate about. Being a refugee migrant myself, I'm very passionate about the topic. So, without further ado, I would just like to do a brief bio about Professor Alison. So Professor Alison holds a UNESCO chair in refugee integration through language and the arts at the University of Glasgow, where she's also a professor of language and intercultural studies, and one of the founding members of Glasgow Refugee Asylum and Migration Network, GRAMNet. She is co-chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Global Challenge Research Fund Advisory Board, and recipient of a number of GCRF grants, as both principal investigator and co-investigator working in Zimbabwe, Gaza, Ghana, Uganda, and with refugees in the UK. Most recently, she was appointed as co-director and co-investigator for the 20 million UK RIGCRF South-South Migration and Equality and Development Hub. Professor Alison also shares the new Scots core group for refugee integration in partnership with the Scots government, COSLA, and Scots Refugee Council. She co-chairs the AHRC GCRF Advisory Board and is an ambassador for the Scots Refugee Council. She's the author of numerous academic books, articles, and a regular international keynote speaker and broadcaster, including most recently, Decolonizing Multilingualism, Struggles to Decreate with Multilingual Matters. Her first collection of poetry, Through Woods, was published in 2009, with a further collection, The Warriors Who Do Not Fight, published in 2018, with co-author Tawana Shitol. In 2018, she was awarded the Decal Visiting Professorship of Otago University. In 2017, she was appointed Adjunct Professor of Hospitality and Tourism at Auckland University of Technology. And in 2016, she was appointed Thinker in Residence at the EU Hague Centre at the University of South Australia. She was also the inaugural Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Waikato Aotearoa in New Zealand in 2013, and is Adjunct Professor of Tourism. In 2011, she was voted the best college teacher by a student body and received the university's Teaching Excellence Award for a career distinguished by excellence. In 2012, again, she received an OBE for service to education and intercultural interreligious relations in Queen's Birthday Honors. And in 2019, she was awarded the Minerva Medal by the Royal Society of Philosophy. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences. If I go and listen to her achievements and awards, I won't have time and space. So, Professor Alison, it's my absolute honor to welcome you to this virtual floor, and of course, a global virtual floor. So, thank you, Professor Alison, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Tesfalam. Thank you, Girmay and Hiab as well for just holding that space, and especially to Hira for those lovely words of introduction to this fantastic series. When I first got the invitation from Hiab and Tesfalam to speak, my gut response was possibly a correct one, which was I really shouldn't do this because there have been far too many white women taking up space in scholarship over the years, and it would be good for you to have this space for yourselves. But I also know and have learned from yourselves, Tesfalam and Girmay and Hiab, not least from the beautiful event we were able to hold last week, celebrating the 75th anniversary of UNESCO, that if we are critical of a system of colonization, imperialism, and oppression, replacing it with a different monolith will be equally problematic, and is perhaps not the correct route for academic justice. And so I stand here not really so much as a scholar in the way that Tesfalam has introduced me, and as is right and proper for such introductions in the academy, but just so that you all feel a bit better, as someone who can barely sit down because I did too much gardening over the weekend, and who just before I logged on today managed to throw my coffee all over the floor as I was setting things up. The nerves before an event like this, they never really leave you. However many times you might do something like this and speak to people, and all the more so because of the immense respect that I have for those of you who are gathered online today. I know that many of you are postgraduates starting out in your studies, and that this is a time where you're beginning to look for guidance and finding your way, but also a time that is unlike when I was doing my PhD over 25 years ago. When guidance was something you looked to those above you for, but where you are at the same time being asked as experts by experience to lead yourselves and to step into a space that can be quite frightening and can be quite unsettling, and where you may not yet have had much experience of leadership, or where your experience of leadership has been out with the academic domain rather than inside it. So it's an absolute delight to be with you and to be here in a spirit of accompaniment and as an accomplice with the academic work we try and do together. And I think it's also important in that context to say that not a single word I speak is original, because every word that I have learnt, I learned from someone else, mostly from my mother and father, who learned their words from their mothers and fathers. And that when we come to talk about everyone's language mattering in the work of integration, we're talking not just about the language of the present, this moment, but we're also talking about the language of the ancestors. We are talking about the languages given to us. We are talking about the words that we have received in the books and scholarship that surround me. I feel like I'm in a cave that is full of the spirits of academic ancestors on my shelves, from theology to migration studies to the work of justice around combating violence and human rights, to my poetry collection, which is right at my hand, to the works of literature and philosophy on the other side, to the monographs that have been written by students who I might have supervised. All of these voices are part of the language that I will bring to bear on any work of scholarship. We cannot ever do justice to the acknowledgements that we need to make, and especially not in the context of decolonizing. In fact, to really do a proper job of inauguration, I should spend my whole time reciting genealogies of scholarship, of language, of art, of policy, of the greats who've gone before us to give us examples, of the artists who've helped us stay alive, and of all those who have written and distilled their words into a set of ideas. I'm going to share my screen with you because I have prepared some slides for us to start with. And I'm just going to pull these up now and share my screen to give you just to give you something to watch, and for myself to have a set of slides that can work to start with. And I'm going to start with this picture, which is a picture of myself. And it's a picture from last week. And it's a picture from this room. And it's already a picture from something that is part of what has gone before. And I'm sharing it with you as a picture of integration. And a picture of integration that was undertaken at the invitation of Hiab and Tesfalam, and at an event where I met Girmay and he played for us. And you can see there, those of you who are of Eritrean background or who are from the now troubled region of the Horn of Africa in the new context of war that is raging there, you can see many objects around me. The cup in my hand, the cloth behind me, the containers that are hanging there, the beadwork that is just next to me, the dress that I'm wearing, and if you look closely, even the earrings in my ears. All of these are elements of integrating and integration that I have come to have as part of my not quite everyday life, but certainly the life of special occasions, and many of them as part of my everyday life. And you can also see the coffee pot in front of me. In this event that Tesfalam and Hiab organised last week with the help of Bella and Girmay and Andit and myself, to really celebrate integration by celebrating one of the key UNESCO sites in Eritrea, Asmara, and doing that by deconstructing and critiquing the colonial inscription that is Asmara itself. And that really brings me to the title that I have here, why integration is a delicate art and needs everyone's languages. So that word delicate, I take from the work of the 18th century German scholar. My first degree was in German. A beautiful poet, a great philosopher, a man with a great deal of leisure to write beautiful poetry and philosophy, and often that is what is required for philosophy and art to flourish. We need time and leisure to make that work happen. But he came up with a term which was delicate empiricism. Delicate empiricism. And I think that's a really helpful term, and it is often applied in the context of phenomenology, the understanding of the phenomena around us. And when I come to thinking about integration as a phenomenon that is emerging constantly whenever new people and new things come into our lives, our homes, our streets, our villages, our towns, our cities, our nations, that delicacy is what is needed. And many of the policies that many of you will have been on the receiving end of, as have I, are the opposite of delicate. And we have an expression in English which is about taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And often these policies are quite clunky, quite heavy, quite framed. They are about imposing a structure, and they can leave all of us feeling a little weary. And it's why I've come to understand integration under a very different rubric and under some different ideas. So I'm going to start with this slide. I hope you can see it. Te Mara Maturu, which is coming from the Māori indigenous traditions. And in the Māori indigenous traditions, they have a delicate art which accompanies every month, which is about attending to the cycles of the moon. And if you wish to integrate life into your life successfully through the cultivation of the land or through the fishing of the sea, you need to know when the moon will be full and what to do on those days. And this is the wisdom of Te Maramataka Turu. There are certain things that you can do on a day when the moon is full, and there are certain things that really won't be very successful. There are certain things that will flow easily and other things which are part of a rhythm of rest. And this calendar of the moon and the calendar of the stars through the different seasons has long been what has guided wise men, magis, and those who are part of traditions of knowledge that are not knowledges that were first inscribed in books. They might have been mapped out in stones. Many people think that some of our ancient monuments and UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the UK, from Orkney through to Stonehenge, are actually great astrological calendars telling us when to do things, when to marry, when to dig crops, when to and how to bury our dead. And that these are ancient knowledges and wisdoms that I want to just return to, and I'll return to time and again as I consider what is sitting underneath the concept of integration, which is often a loss of traditions like that and a need to find them again and make them again in a new context. And I say this particularly mindful of the fact that I come from a line and a lineage that were cleared from the lands as part of the colonial projects, that I come from an ancestry in the north of England that were taken off their lands as their lands were enclosed and as they lost their lands and put to work in the cotton mills of Lancashire, in the factories, in often quite horrific conditions that we've replicated in other parts of the world, in the sweatshops of Southeast Asia particularly. And that in those cotton mills, many other people joined after the Second World War from particularly the Asian subcontinent to work in those mills as part of actually addressing the labour deficits that had been produced by two immense world wars and the devastation that they had wrought on the United Kingdom. So I say all of this because what we're talking about here is indeed as delicate an art as trying to work out which stars are rising or falling, or as any Muslim will know, when the moon of Ramadan has risen, which is indeed a delicate art of placing it and understanding where it is in the sky. And I think that those wisdoms that accompany us and are surrounding us and are part of a wider cosmology are as important as the ever-changing and often ephemeral dimensions of policy. Kofi Annan, the great poet of the Rwandan genocide and West African scholar of African humanities, puts his understanding of what has happened to the knowledges of the peoples of the global south under colonialism and slavery and warfare like this. In his poem, he says, "But we lost our breath among the hostile winds." We lost our breath among the hostile winds. And my contention here is that everyone has lost their breath amongst the hostile winds. Some have gained from a situation of colonialism and imperialism and profiting from war, and others have lost a good deal of knowledge. But any of those gains, as we're seeing with the reckonings of this moment under the rubric of Black Lives Matters, and particularly within my own institution at the University of Glasgow, of asking the question, who profited and who continues to profit from the work of slavery that those who bought and built the campus of the University of Glasgow on Gilmore Hill, who profited from that work in the colonies, particularly in the West Indies and Jamaica, that too demonstrates the deficits that will come to be reckonings in the future. And just as those questions we're asking now about the work of 200 years ago and who profited and what the consequences are that are ongoing, I believe similar questions will be asked by the people to come and the scholars to come and the PhDs that will be written maybe 200 years from now about this moment in time where there was indeed the mass death of refugees on the borders of Europe and on the borders of the United States of America, and where help was not forthcoming to many of the people who needed it, particularly thinking now of the detention camps in Libya and of the acute humanitarian disaster that is unfolding within the context of East Africa at the moment. And that's just to take two examples. That word disaster in English comes from the word aster, which means stars. Dis Starring might be another way of understanding, or de-starring, a disaster, as if we've taken the stars by which we might navigate out of the skies, as if we are completely lost. We lost our breath among the hostile winds, or as David Wagoner has said in a beautiful poem, you are lost. And then he comes back to that phrase and says, but you are not lost. The place where you stand, he says, is called here, and you must treat it like a powerful stranger. So there again comes delicate empiricism around the phenomenology of a powerful stranger. And in integration, what we are dealing with, be it policymakers, be it the UK Home Office, be it other refugees and asylum seekers, be it other people who've come via different immigration routes, be it your lecturers and your teachers, be it the health authorities you might be interacting with, all are powerful strangers. And treating one another as a powerful stranger is part of the delicate art of integration. So my first concept to really think with around this is not so much the concept of integration, but of integration as hospitality. And again, going right back to the forefathers, and these in my own tradition, the desert fathers, those who went into the wilderness to sit on tops of rock pillars and think, to give themselves the luxury, the break, the detox time, the chance to unhook from Wi-Fi back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the Common Era. They were the wise people that folk went to find to say, but what shall I do? And there's this lovely story of one going to find one of these hermits living in the desert. And he was moaning and complaining, and he was saying, listen, the grass is growing up my chimney. And the hermit, the desert father, replied to him and said, you have driven away hospitality. You've driven away hospitality. If you do not light a fire that all can sit around, the grass will literally grow up your chimney. And when we look at areas of our common life where the grass is growing up our chimney, where hospitality has been driven out, what we often see are devastated communities. For example, in Bulgaria, there are villages that are literally dying out because the populations are aging so much, where the youngest in a village might be 75 years old. And they have said that they would rather die out than take in people who are seeking refuge into empty homes in their village. That is a living example in the 21st century of precisely what the Desert Fathers were saying here. The grass is growing up your chimneys. You have no right to complain. There are people who can bring life and liveliness to your homes, who can bring warmth to the hearth, but you have driven away hospitality. So thinking about hospitality, those moments of welcome, how we offer welcome, how we hold that powerful stranger of David Wagoner is important. And Derrida, the great postmodern scholar of the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century, said in 2000 that hospitality is culture itself. Hospitality is culture itself. And when you think with Raymond Williams about everything that comes under the orbit of culture, how we are guided by the stars in different traditions, how we drink our coffee, how we make a bed, how we organize our household, when we take our meals, what our music sounds like, what influences we allow into our music. And I'm thinking here especially of Girmay with his Cuban salsa, Eritrean horizontal jazz, which is one of the most amazing sounds that I've heard this year. That hospitality is culture itself. And what Girmay represents isn't a purism about how to do Eritrean music correctly, but an openness, a musical hospitality, where his musical talent is hospitality and therefore is making culture itself. A living embodiment of how you might integrate with the influences around you as you go. And just after our meeting last week, our event last week, Girmay met two of the artists in residence within my own program, Gamali and Denso Tojro from Ghana. And before we'd even known it, the hospitality and openness to the music of each other was so strong that basically a new album was being recorded within the first 5 minutes. And Girmay can either nod or shake his head to agree or disagree with me at that point. So hospitality is culture itself, says Derrida. Integration as hospitality then becomes a question of mutual, reciprocal hospitality. It is not the work, however much the policymakers may intend or cast this, it is not the work of placing all of the burden on those who have arrived to learn our language, follow our employment regulations, dress like a Westerner, eat like a Westerner, sleep like a Westerner, make your coffee like a Westerner. Heaven forbid that we would do that. But instead, mutual reciprocal hospitality, trying it on for size, but also knowing where you're from, knowing where your anchors are in the world and how you might bring those forward. It's individual and it's collective. It's about how I live my life, how I open myself out in the ways that Tesfalam and Hiab were encouraging me to do for the event last week, with dress and coffee and culture and music, within my own family, within my city, within the space of the world. But it's also collective. It's how we organize and are able to do that with one another as well. Martin Buber, the German philosopher, spoke of this, and I'm giving you the German word because I'm very proud of the fact that I can say it, and that I learned German back in the day. Das Zwischenmenschliche is what integration as hospitality might be understood as. Das Zwischenmenschliche. It's not a great word to say under COVID because you end up spitting at everybody. You need a mask on to wear it. But it translates as the what is in between human beings is what is important. And how we look at this word of the best way of translating it, I think, is as the quick of human relatedness, that point in between us where we can genuinely meet and find something, find a meeting point. And we often find that in greetings. When I greet you and tell you I've knocked over my coffee cup, you all know who I am and you all feel comfortable talking to me about the time, I hope, when you also were clumsy and the moon wasn't in the right phase and you knocked over your coffee cup. Or where I tell you that I'm aching from doing a bit too much physical work, you've got a point of connection with me as a human being, rather than in the way that I sound when I'm being presented professionally. Das Zwischenmenschliche, the point of human connection, that is what binds us all. Thinking back to that quotation about the grass growing up the chimney, these are the clearances in Scotland. This is what it looked like when people were cleared off the land, sent overseas to the so-called New World, which really wasn't. It was a world inhabited by the indigenous peoples of native peoples of North America, of Australia, of New Zealand. But the Scots who went on many of those journeys, not entirely, had often lost their own lands and been cleared. They were, to quote my friend and Maori elder in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when he met me, he said, Glasgow, yeah, Scotland. We called you refugees when you arrived back then in the 1840s. These are also ancestral histories that need delicacy, because the stories that those today tell us of being refugees are also stories of others in other families who may have come to be in much more dominant positions these days, but are also refugee stories. And we see it time and again. You have a choice. Do you pull up the drawbridge and say, well, I'm safe now, therefore everyone else can stay away? Or do you keep it down, keep it open, and say, we will keep a fire burning in the hearth? A home without hospitality is a terrible thing. And hospitality today is very much culture, very much how we make it. The definition of hospitality is of the reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. And in the Oxford English Dictionary, we say of liberality and goodwill. And I love that idea of liberality. To be liberal with something means to be expansive with it or generous with it, and to have goodwill, not grudging, miserable, penny pinching. That's not hospitality. That's not liberality. And anyone who has experienced good hospitality will know it looks like a tray of food that is groaning. It looks like a bed that is well made and comfortable. You know what people will do for you when they are hosting you, but you also know how people will respond to that when they are being good guests. And that word host and guest in the original Greek was the same word. To xenia meant host guest or guest host. It wasn't divided down the middle in two separate categories, but you were doing the work of hosting and of guesting in one and the same way. And I think these are really important integrated notions that we can hold on to. In her work on xenia, Anne Carson writes about guest friendship, about the guest host. In a wonderful book called The Economy of the Unlost, and she's thinking about the work of artists. And she says that there came a fundamental shift when the focus went on to money, not on the gift. So culture or food or transactions in gifts rather than were taken over by transactions in money. And she speaks of Simonides, the poet, who was the first of the Greek poets to turn up at events and to say, you're going to pay me, rather than to give of his talents for free. And she says, no one who handles money remains unchanged. No one who handles money remains unchanged. And she sees that one of the histories of the West in philosophy is the history of the change that was wrought by the handling of money. She says that xenia, the spirit of hospitality and good integration as hospitality, isn't penny pinching, isn't saying, well, I'll do this work if you pay me, isn't looking at that element. It is emphatically, she says, non-mercantile in spirit. Profit is not the point. In fact, the point, she says, is to put yourself in debt. The point is to put yourself in debt. Which is why, when I am invited by yourselves to give a talk, I understand this very much as non-mercantile in spirit. That this is part of you hosting me. And it's a particularly powerful reversal because so much of the time I am the one in this culture being asked to host. So there is something very lovely and very gentle for me to be in a space where I have the chance to develop the artistry, to sing for my supper, as we used to call it, and to be part of that non-mercantile spirit, and to receive an invitation rather than to give an invitation, to be part of your guest friendship in the academic sphere. And maybe just to make a little plug here for some work that my colleague Maria Grazia Imperiale and Giovanna Facetta are taking forward, where they're looking at academic hospitality and building on some work I did a few years ago, what that might mean, and particularly what it might mean in an online context. So the point, my friends, is to put yourself in debt with this work, just as we are indebted to the ancestors in the books that surround us, to the people who spent their time proofreading, checking, writing, publishing, speaking, teaching, so that we could come to this moment and do this piece of work, which we do standing on the shoulders of giants. Jodie Foster, the great actress, once said in one of her commemoration speeches that she gave, "Make the library your friend, but know that you will never read the library, that you will always need to enter a library with a spirit of humility. You will always be in debt to the many who have gone before you. Even if you don't agree with all the thinking that they've done, the fact that you don't agree with them gives you a starting point for the work." So here, I think in hospitality and integration, we're talking about a gift economy of reciprocity, where collectively and individually, we're practicing the art of hospitality. And that then means that what we're seeing integration as is the giving and receiving of gifts, which then lead to culture making culture anew, and also culture protecting, because in the act of sharing a culture, we share what is precious to us. And that means that we are attending to it, and we are making sure it's something that we know and understand to be precious, be that the learning of a language, be that the offering of an artistic form. Much of the time in our work looking at refugee narratives and decolonizing, we use a lot of Ds. I've already given you disaster and decolonizing, disintegration, we watch as things fall apart, displacement, as people are taken from a place they were to another place, dispossession, as land and goods are removed and taken to other places, especially this is Cape Coast slave fort, but there are many other places we could go to where goods were plundered and placed in the British Museum. Decolonisation. And then finally, the one that I've done my work with, both intellectually and personally, the term decreation. It's a term that Anne Carson uses, and also a term used by the poet and philosopher Simone Weil. And she was writing at times not dissimilar to our own, of disintegration, of disaster within Europe and the European context. And she speaks of decreation as the idea of making something which has to pass into being uncreated. That in order to really rethink and reform ourselves, but also in order to do integration, we have to do what we can't do. So I'm sure, and I hope he doesn't mind me taking him as an example, that in order to be a salsa teacher or learn to play Cuban music, Guillermai had to start at the beginning. Already being a proficient musician in his own tradition, he had to pick up new rhythms and learn them. And that to start with, it would be like me knocking over my coffee cup. It would be clumsy and awkward, unless you're just a natural Guillermai. It would be clumsy and awkward. It wouldn't necessarily sit in the beautiful forms it now sits in. There's something about being uncreated from your place of solid knowledge, from your epistemological position, particularly for those of us in the West whose epistemologists have dominated, to have to say, we do not know and we do not possess frameworks which can allow us to understand the world, because the way the world is and the way that we might understand it has been forgotten or has been neglected, and that what is in these books around me is not what is in the stars and the moon and the songs and the wisdom and the oral poetry and the dress and the traditions and the art of making the coffee. So I think there's something important and different for me between destruction, which is making something created pass into nothingness, and decreation, which is making something created pass into being uncreated, because from that place we are humbled enough to allow other knowledges and flows to come in. From that place we have a chance of lighting a fire that might take the grass out of the chimney. So what might this look like in practice? And I'm just going to take a few more minutes to maybe give you a few examples, and then I'll finish with some personal reflections. So one of my jobs is to chair the New Scots framework for the Scottish Government, a partnership with the local authorities, the Scottish Refugee Council and Scottish Government. We had our meeting this morning. We speak in acronyms, we speak in frameworks, we speak in work streams, we speak in Gantt charts, we speak in diagrams, we speak in the standard language of theory of change of NGOs, third sector organisation and accountability. We understand New Scots as anyone who lives in Scotland as integrated from day one, and this is different to the policy in England and Wales. And we work with indicators of integration that come from my colleagues, Alistair Ajar and Alison Strang. They were working on these in the early part of the 21st century. And these are the markers that really sit underneath most of the integration policies for the United Kingdom. Employment, housing, education and health are the markers and means of integration. If you have employment, if you have housing, if you have education, if you can navigate the health system. The things that connect us, they call social bridges, social bonds, social links. The things that facilitate those connections are language and cultural knowledge and safety and stability in communities. And the foundation of them all is a human rights-based framework. And every single one of the elements of New Scots, all those 7 domains, is underpinned by international law and international human rights law, which also then means that we're often on a collision course with the UK government that, of course, is stepping out of the European framework for human rights with Brexit. I think it's important to show the distinction. You know, this is the diagram. It's a white page, it's black writing, it's tidied up. None of that messiness that I've been talking about, or the delicacy that I have been talking about, is there. It's a starting point, and Alison and Alistair would be the first to say that what this then looks like in practice is so very different. In my experience of leading a number of projects and enabling a lot of people to do this, but also mainly of learning from communities and refugee and asylum people and from Indigenous people about what integration looks like under these frameworks of integration as hospitality, and then integration as fostering new life, new possibilities, starting again, then I found the thing I've needed to do is learn from the most unexpected of places. Not people sitting at desks, but all clustering around a table making something, standing on chairs, as you can see, looking rather more like they're involved in a dance or a game than that they are sitting at a policy table. And I've seen that one of the things that many of the policymakers do under these rubrics is work with deficit models. The problem of refugees and asylum seekers is that they do not speak good enough English. They do not understand our healthcare structure. They do not understand social security. They do not yet have enough education to be able to access our higher education institutions. It's a deficit model. And often people want to count the extent of that deficit. What percentage is it? How can we measure it? And there's a place for these questions and for this knowledge, but it's very much a Western model as a deficit model. It's very much about saying it's not yet good enough. And the important critiques of integration models, particularly those that have been led from decolonizing scholars and from those of refugee and asylum background, have all said the same thing. Actually, often the deficit is not with the guest culture, but with the hosting culture, because the hosting culture has not decreated itself. It hasn't thought that there might be other ways of having a policy meeting than sitting in leather chairs at a walnut table with a set of meeting papers on an expensive iPad. But actually, there are ways of having discussions and meetings, such as the one we were having last Monday, as we sat around on a Zoom call and drank coffee together, according to the Eritrean way of making policies in households and families. And that those ways of making conversation are also how children learn language, how artistic practices and cultural practices are transmitted, and where we are able to not so much understand integration as assimilation, but as that mutual reciprocity that I mentioned. Within the UNESCO chair, we've been learning from unexpected places like Gaza and Ghana and Eritrea and Zimbabwe, and that people always say to me, but why are you looking at these contexts? Why aren't you looking at Canada and the Canadian model? Or why aren't you looking at Germany? Germany took 1 million refugees. And I always say, but that's nothing. That is nothing compared to the experiences of these contexts and these cultures who have taken in the largest numbers of refugees worldwide, continue to do that. If you're looking even just at South Sudan at the moment and parts of Ethiopia, what's happening there, it is absolutely clear that dealing with displacement and is a way of life, is something that is practiced rather like the drinking of coffee. And that we have no right to the arrogance that pretends that we know what we're talking about in the West, particularly not in the United Kingdom, where numbers of asylum seekers are dropping rapidly, where resettlement programs have been put on pause until very, very recently, just last week, an announcement that they will start again, and where the numbers are minuscule compared to much of the rest of the world. We've very much focused within our UNESCO programme on arts and languages as the cultural enablers of integration in order to move beyond the deficit models. And we often say our work is to hold the bowl of tears and expand the space for joy, and that we do this together. We do this with some intellectual input, some artistic input, administrative input, and that we're trying to work across the board in the ways that we do that, but very much trying to work with models of plenty, not models of deficit. Not least because if I then say to my team, the problem is that you don't speak good enough English, the retort will be immediately, yeah, but I speak a lot more languages than you do, Alison. And that, again, is often the case when we're looking at these models of deficit. And with the arts, this delicate art that I'm speaking of around integration, people seem to wish, says Elaine Scarry, there to be beauty, even when their own self-interest is not served by it. Or perhaps more accurately, people seem to intuit that their own self-interest is served by distant peoples having the benefit of beauty. And so I want to come back with this final slide to my starting slide, to the beauty of the stars and the moon and that guidance that we might receive from a clear night, to the beauty of wisdoms that are beyond those that might be held in many of the books. And I want to come back to this idea of being served by the knowledge and the wisdom, the delicate arts of artistry and beauty and the production of language. And I want to do it just by reading a little from the poetry that I mentioned of David Wagner and his understanding and thinking about this. Much of what I believe decolonizing, decreating work is about scholars of the North doing decreative work, hard work, acknowledging what they don't know, and learning from other places and other times, which will mean a relearning, an unmaking of the body, an unmaking of the mind, and an unmaking of the heart. And moving beyond those comforts and luxuries of peacetime in Europe that have been built on wartime elsewhere. And so the question is, how do we find our way south? And the answer to that question is amongst us, is living with us, is trying to find a way into the academies and the institutions that are around us, and is trying to find a way to enter a conversation that has been dominated by others for far too long. I think it's really important when I get to a point where I say, I'm lost. And when I can hear the words of the poet David Wagner in his poem Lost say, stand still, the trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. For my stars are not your stars. We're not all under one sky when we're under our sky, and we're not all of one earth when we tend our earth. And my words are not my words, and your words are not your words under the great stories of the sky. It's a delicate art, integration. It needs a lot of tenderness and attention, and it needs us to unlearn and unmake and decreate much of what we have held as dear in the past. And that will mean a constant process of surrendering power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Well, I wish I have the intellectual and then the scholarly caliber to reflect on this wonderful talk. So I would just like to open the floor for questions, comments, and reflections for our audience, please.
Hi, I'm on a phone, so I can't work out how to put my hand up, but I do have a question.
Come on then, that should be fine. We can hear you.
Okay, hi, really thank you so much for that presentation. It was so unbelievably both confirming and thought-provoking. for myself. I'm just started my undergraduate research at York St John's for the International Centre of Community Music, and so hospitality, community music as an act of hospitality is something that's talked about a lot. That you've given me so much there to work with. I really thank you for that. And also specifically, it's also a bit of a wider question as well for everyone else that's been involved. My undergraduate research, it focused particularly on one project and two bits of work with two Eritrean musicians, one gangster rapper and one traditional Eritrean musician. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the act of translation that we might go through there to remediate that story in English. And what, if you thought of any, might be the ethical challenges in doing that, or?
Yeah, that's Rory, thank you. Thanks very much for coming. And what a fantastic question. This book is a really good book. This book is written by my colleague and friend, Boaventura de Sousa Santos. I love saying his name. It's a bit like saying Das Zwischenmenschliche.
I know Boaventura as well. I've met him previously online, yeah.
On your undergraduate, that's fantastic. But he's got, I mean, a chapter in this book is on intercultural translation. And I think it's a really interesting concept. I remember interviewing him for a journal back in, I think, 2007, where he was just working that concept out. And he's really developed it over time to look at epistemicide, so the way in which Western knowledge has destroyed much Southern knowledge or marginalized it, those knowledges of the stars and the body and music and much intangible cultural heritage. I think his work on intercultural translation is really excellent. Where he's actually seeing the processes that need to go on. But I think maybe just to say, for me, some real guidance points are, have I been invited into this work? If I haven't, I should wait until I have. So the invitation as hospitality is absolutely key to me as if you like, an ethical practice. And at the moment, I'm working with UNESCO in Paris and their new art lab to develop we've got about 70 pages of a working document, but to develop a document that will actually lay out some ethical guidance for ethical practices for work like this, for everyone concerned, because ethics are everyone's business. And it's very, very easy for us, I think, to believe that all the bad work has been done by people like me or people like you, with accents like yours and accents like mine. And all the good work is being done by anyone who's not like us. And actually, it's just not true. There is no pure place to stand. This is one of my favorite watchwords around this work. Everybody comes from a culture that at some point has colonized someone, from a family that has some point dominated someone. Everyone as a human being has been at some point involved in some act of perpetrating, whether consciously or not, violence, and has been on the end of violence. And you know, I do an exercise in one of the workshops I run where I will say to people, you know, just look at the labels in your clothes. Just look at the labels in your clothes, and where did they come from? What's the genealogy of what you're wearing? And for most of us, that genealogy will end up in a sweatshop. And so there's no pure place to stand. And
it's really interesting that particularly. Just I was having a conversation just about that yesterday with my partner, who's an anthropologist, about the way that different people dress. She talked about migration journeys from in Guatemala across the American border, and if you're trying to get across the border, your clothes will be immaculate, and these sorts of ideas that about so that's really interesting.
So yeah, I think, you know, that point you're making, Rory, I think invitation is really important. And I suppose the other, I mean, for me, my life is lived amongst refugees, and I suppose the other thing that I have unlearned from my training in interview methods and social sciences is you don't ask people to tell their story, ever. You just don't ask. If people want to share their story with you, if you happen to be in an environment where it is safe enough for them to share their story, then that is fine. And equally for me, because if you are drawn into this work, you're not drawn into this work. You're drawn into this work by things in your own life that will be wounds or difficulties that are potentially unresolved, or that you might carry within your DNA in that understanding of intergenerational trauma. And therefore, if you haven't done the work, the interior work, and be that, work with a therapist or work with counseling or work with music or work with storytelling, whatever it is that is the form that will bring the release of what is a wound in your own life, then you shouldn't share your own story either, because it's not going to be safe for those who are listening. So that I think those two elements of both invitation into hospitality, but also a minding of the stories. And a beautiful thing that my colleague Gamli Todro does whenever he has a workshop is say to people, what story would you like to tell today? Rather than come and tell your story. And it's just that slight change.
It's very funny that as well, because my part of my professional role is I work in an area called Lincoln Green in Leeds in using an asset-based community building methodology. And it's all about finding, what do you want to do? What is your thing? What is, and that's like, it's very crude and, run by a local authority, and the terminology is, awful, but, that is something that is within me, on a conscious level. But thank you very much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Alison. Suad, Bella, do we have questions from the audience?
I think we have a couple
of. Suad?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yes. So the first question is from someone who's asking about the title of the talk that you gave, Alison, and how can they reference this quote for an essay? It's a very powerful quote.
Do you know, so that's my own, it's my own development. I've been thinking a lot about delicacy, and just partly because I'm just so sick of people going, this is what will fix it, and it won't, it will just smash it. And also just the work that I was doing this morning with the New Scots framework, these are the most amazing people who sit on this committee. They are, that some of them are civil servants, some of them are volunteers, some of them are working with NGOs. Oh my goodness, they work hard and they think hard and they work to try and translate the experiences that they are having as refugees and as people supporting integration into the language of the policymakers and the funders and the accountants and the auditors to make sure we can keep doing the work. But I think what I see them all doing is just stepping around the difficulties. So if you want to reference it, I think you should reference it as a Zoom talk or as a symposium or a seminar. Obviously giving credit to the organizers of the seminar. So rather like you might an edited volume of a book or a chapter in an edited book, you can just see me as one of the chapters in the book. But I think that maybe feeds into something I have in this little book. I wrote a little book because I wanted to deconstruct these big books, like this one. I mean, the complete works of Shakespeare, it's going to take you a while to read it. But I feel like, we're in quite urgent times. And I've just thrown it on the floor and it's knocked something else over. It's not my day today. But yeah, I wanted to write a little book because I wanted to write something quickly and I knew I wouldn't have time otherwise because there were so many pressures on me. And it was so lovely to write a short book. It's only 30,000 words, to have chapters that are 1,000 words and to find a form that was different. And in it, I make quite a plea in the manifesto on decolonizing multilingualism, struggles to decreate, and decreation, very much what I've spoken about today. And I just say, we need to be citing far more widely than academic scholarship. I need to be able to cite that. That's the stone from a beach. I need to be able to cite this. This is artwork of the dreaming from the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. I need to find ways of understanding that what that represents, what that artwork is potentially the equivalent of a PhD or a chapter in a book. It's holding knowledge, it's holding pathways, it's holding ways of understanding. Yeah, I need to be able to reference the work that women do making coffee and teaching me the coffee ceremony and who I learnt it from. And that's very much within the folk tradition of music. So those of you who are musicians will understand that very much. And certainly, you know, within the folk tradition in Scotland, if you hear someone who's a singer or a fiddle player, they will say, I learned this tune from Rory MacDonald, who learned it from his father, who was a fiddler or a piper on the Isle of Lewis and that genealogy, that's a way of referencing. And I think, you know, what I really I'm enjoying about the scary biography of myself that Tesfalam just read out, is that I can say, do you know what, we're going to cite this. I have that right to open that path. And then others can do it and they can go, but Alison said it was okay. So therefore, as part of scholarship from the UNESCO chair, this is what we can reference. And I do think we need a much wider understanding of how it is we know what we know.
Thank you, Alison. Here, I think we have so people who have raised their hands. So go back to you here.
Yeah, there is one person. Fanya, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you for pronouncing that correctly. Most often it doesn't go that way. Thank you so much for well, this great event that you organize, and thank you, Alison, for this wonderful talk and for wonderful music at the beginning. It was really refreshing. I have so many things that I would like to talk about or ask about or just generally open, but if I may, just a couple, if that's all right. So just something I've been thinking about recently, and you know, it kind of came up really because I've been thinking about this whole idea of integration a lot recently, and recently I've been in a couple of conversations with friends, and one of them was wearing. She's a filmmaker, and she was going to this event that she was invited to present her film about people living in Palestine. And she then asked me if it was appropriate, if I thought it was appropriate for her to wear a black dress with certain patterns that were made by her friend from Palestine because of all this kind of cultural appropriation. So that's one thing. And then another thing, my neighbor was telling me how her boy really is into football and really wants to do his hair in a style that she thought wasn't, again, culturally appropriate. Now, and I find this really interesting. I think it comes, you know, with a certain luggage that people carry with them where they come from. And I personally don't feel like that where I come from in my background. But I found this really interesting. And I think a lot of the time, equally, like you're talking about integration being, you know, used really, you know, you describe it so beautifully in using like art of making culture and mutual reciprocal hospitality and everything what is in between people. And, you know, to take it's so much greater and bigger than what is generally being discussed. And if we think about it in those terminologies, but then there is this kind of cultural appropriation that comes in between. So when you showed your photograph at the image at the very beginning, that was the first thing that came up to my mind about what would my friends think now. So that's one thing, yeah? So if you could reflect a little bit about where you stand on that. And the second thing, I was just generally, because I personally really have I kind of find integration, even though I'm working in a context where I need to use it a lot with, you know, local authorities and policy people, I find it a very problematic terminology. My background, I'm a visual anthropologist. So in anthropology, no one speaks about integration. It's a kind of term that is just not being used. And I think it stopped being used ages ago. So I was almost shocked when I kind of came to work with in this kind of context where it is being used. And I was again wondering, you are, as a person who is on the one hand kind of clearly criticizing it, or how it's being used, but on the other hand, you are also working with policy people and among policymakers, etc. How do you think, you know, because it's really, you know, words have power, don't they? And they're really important and they matter. So how can we move forward in a way that would not be, oh, but I don't mean it in that way, and then you take half an hour to explain what you mean by it, but it would actually make sense beyond us needing to explain and justify everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and absolutely, it's a terrible term within anthropology. Most other disciplines are nowhere close to the understandings that anthropology has of integration. If you work in social policy, if you work in sociology, it's a term that is maybe just beginning to get some critical ink. You know, when I was working and studying in French and German contexts, you know, we were reading Derrida in the original. I now am based within a school of education that has recently found within a discipline that's recently found Derrida. So the speed at which concepts move into other disciplines from the ones where they've been first founded or first critiqued is long and slow. I mean, I've been an academic now for 25 years, and I'm just seeing some concepts that I read originally in French beginning to emerge in the discipline that I'm part of. So I think we need to bear with one another and be patient with one another around the terminology used. And I think it's very easy to just jump in and go, no, you can't say that word. And then we're all just into semantics without actually understanding, and I'm also a linguist, how language works, how translation works. So a term like integration for me is a really helpful translation term. I have always, in any of the titles of jobs that I've had, looked for a term that will be an enabler or a bridge into the world where people get stuff done, rather than talking about what people might do. And there's a big distinction there. We can make it between academics and policymakers or activists or NGOs or humanitarian workers. But for me, it's really important that we use the bridge words, and integration's a bridge word. So when I was proposing the title for the UNESCO chair, I said I want a word that's really tricky, that I don't like intellectually, because then I can talk about what's wrong with it, and that can then be a vehicle for moving fields out with the quite rarefied space where we all talk about why we hate integration and why it's a terrible concept. And I'm seeing similar things happening with decolonizing at the moment. So, you know, the critical link is, for goodness sake, decolonizing, terrible term. It's like, you know, it's like being wed. It's like staying in a divorce. It's always looking back. It's about talking about what's been terrible. We need something like decentering, or I'm using decreating. But it's an enabler. It's an enabler. It will allow me to have conversations in teaching, in research, in policy, that can then begin to shift the language. The philosopher Martin Heidegger says that poetry is the language of the future. It speaks the unconcealedness of being. Dichterisch wohnt der Mensch, he says, poetically one dwells. And I think for me, I mean, poetry is where I go for a different form of language. But you have to be judicious with poetry. You don't need it 24/7. It's like only ever eating really rich, dark chocolate mousse. You need a little bit. And for the rest of the time, you need, you know, your kind of bread and butter and the stuff that's familiar. So for me, a word like integration, or in my personal chair, languages and intercultural studies, intercultural, absolutely critiqued to death in my field. Yeah, and in a field where I pretty much was part of a founding group to bring critical intercultural studies into being. However, United Nations have whole sections on intercultural dialogue. I'm not going to turn my back on that amazing work that people do there, that genuinely makes a huge difference to people's lives, because I don't like terminology, or because I haven't quite understood how a semantic shift happens. And maybe just one last thing on language. During 2015 and the so-called refugee crisis, which was a crisis of hospitality and not a refugee crisis, I got a phone call from a government, a high-up government official saying, what's happening? Suddenly everyone's shouting at us for using the word migrant. They're saying, don't talk about migrants, talk about refugees. Migrants is so disrespectful. And this had come out, it felt like, of a clear blue sky, and in the wake of the publication of the photograph of Aylan Kurdi. And I just said, this is 101 semantic shift. When our social experiences are in solution, when everything is being changed, it takes a while for us to have a language for it. Think of the situation, which people keep talking about, that we're in at the moment. People talk about it as the situation we are in. It is what it is. COVID-19, the pandemic, the lockdown, the levels, the restrictions. We have no settled language in English, even amongst policymakers, with which to talk about a major traumatic global experience that has disrupted everyone's lives. Because As human beings, language comes later. Think about how long it takes a little kid to learn to speak when they're first learning. My granddaughter, she can say, Alison, don't do that, or it's not fair. But she's not really yet got to the nuances of why integration is a problematic term, which it absolutely is in anthropology. So that's on the language question. And for me, it's like, you've just got to go with the flow. I mean, any symbolic form will not represent what the actual thing is that it's speaking to. Be it a song, be it a word, it just won't ever be a complete representation, because we're not capable of doing that. That's what we have in our everyday life. So the other one on cultural appropriation, again, it's about invitation for me, but it's also about, I mean, I'm a performer, I'm an actor, I work in theatre as well. So I've spent my whole life wearing costumes and slipping into other roles. So some of my work around this is around costuming and thinking about what and how dress will trouble, disrupt, soothe, enable. And so me using an image of myself wearing a costume which I have been invited to wear by Eritreans will immediately play as white woman culturally appropriating in the discourses of white liberal critical academia at the moment. And I know that. And I know it's important that it does, so we can have good dialogue and good conversation about this. When I launched this little book, I did it in Addis Ababa in the Centre for Peace and Reconciliation at the university there, and it was the person hosting me was a former PhD student of mine who works on law and political trials, so he was hosting it. He was very much in control of the session. I'd done my talk and sat down, and he then had to do his legal, lawyerly interrogation of me afterwards. And he said, Alison, I've known you for a long time. I've known what you do and what you say. I know you as a person. He said, but, isn't what you're doing just cultural appropriation? And I just didn't even take a beat. And I can see Tesfalem already smiling because he knows what I'm going to say. And I said the African man wearing a sharp Western suit to the white European woman wearing a skirt given to her by a woman from Africa. So the question then is, who's appropriating what from whom? And just looking around, even at the faces that I can see on screen, I'm sorry, but you guys are all appropriating my stuff just as much as I'm appropriating your stuff. And pretty much every single one of us will be appropriating something from the factories of China and Southeast Asia. And I'd really, I think there's some really great work being done here. I mean, Adanto Atodro is just completing a thesis at the moment, looking at fashion and appropriation and dress and form and style. My feeling is, if you are making a profit out of this, then you need to pay the money back. But if this is part of that gift economy I spoke about, if this is part of honouring others' traditions by respecting those cultures and traditions, then it's actually important to feel really uncomfortable and wear some weird stuff from my point of view. So in the work that I do in West Africa, my colleague Nadensa has turned me into her anthropological research project. So rather than me interviewing her about the cloths that she might use to make clothing with, as the white Western anthropologist interviewing a Ga costume maker and dressmaker, she dresses me. She chooses the cloth that I should wear for different meetings or different events or different performances. And then she listens to how people respond to my body in those clothes. And what's really interesting is that she can understand what they say about what I look like, and I can't. And that makes me feel extremely uncomfortable because I want to know what they're saying about me. But actually, it's a really helpful experience for me to know what it means for your body to be othered and to have a tiny taste of that othering, for good and bad, that goes alongside those other markers, those visual markers, particularly of race. And whilst I wouldn't in any way claim that that puts me in a place where I can in any way understand what a racial marker is, it does do something. It troubles that skin boundary when I wear cloth that is appropriate to certain contexts. And so I think, again, cultural appropriation as a critique or a critical category, it's too simplistic. It's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And actually having these awkward conversations about what I look like and what I'm wearing and why I've chosen to wear it are actually what scholarship is for, and how we respond to and think about those kinds of elements that trouble us and make us feel uncomfortable. Or even if I'm wearing my Zuria on the street because I've been asked to wear it for a family member's baptism, it's Glasgow. This is white. It's pouring with rain. The streets are covered in mud. I mean, this is wildly impractical material. And again, I think for us to understand through new materialism where cloth, where customs and conventions have come from that are, for me, I will always wear a scarf in the Sudan because you need a scarf over your hair because the sandstorms are just, they'll just rip them to shreds. So just as I'll always wear a woolly hat in winter in Glasgow, so that things that might have become reified into cultural tradition and appropriation might then change when we actually look more deeply and ask more questions of material, materiality, design, fabric, craft, all of those questions. There you go. That wasn't a very short answer. I'm sorry, but thank you very much for the question.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting, and I very much agree with you personally.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Vanya, for your comments and contributions and the question. I want to practice hospitality. I've been taught hospitality now, and I want to practice that. So I want to give, I'm conscious of the time. We've got, I think, less than 10 minutes of our time. So I would like to give the time again to our guests today. And maybe if we get the opportunity, then I'll have a question for Alison. So Hiyab, Suad, Bella, do we have questions?
Yes, we do.
We can't hear you.
Yeah,
that's good.
A question was raised, what is meant by integration as assimilation? I think it's kind of linked to what we were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, assimilation is a term that was used. I mean, it's a pretty horrific term, which was become like us, but you can never be like us, that people might use or say. It went alongside some really problematic racial discourses in the North America of passing. Can you pass as a native? But I think there's a lot, and it's a term that has eventually fallen out of fashion, just as I think integration will. I think we may well come to then speak about hospitality or other terms. And then we'll start to critique those, and culture and experience and time will pass, and we'll find another word, and it may not be a word that yet exists. It may be a word from another language, because other languages often have better terminology or conceptions of themselves. So, but I think one of the things that has happened in the culture wars that have been raged around this particular space is that some people, particularly in the right-wing media, want integration to mean assimilation. Partly because they know that you can only ever fail at it, and partly because that's just what they think it must mean. And they haven't actually read all the policy documents in Europe and in UNESCO and in the United Nations and in the Scottish government and the New Zealand government and the German government, which talk about, I mean, all of them talk about integration is a multilateral, two-way process. It is as much about the host culture changing as part of hospitality as it is about the guest culture changing. And integration I see as really happening at its best when those who are new Scots, those who have arrived, are the ones who are doing the hosting, just as you are doing it now, which is why we've been so delighted to provide the Zoom support and technical backup for your hospitality. A little like being the grocer's shop around the corner that makes sure you've got enough milk in the fridge. Because that's I think when we're really starting to see something much more important emerging that isn't about assimilation. That said, I do think that there are some important concepts around the old idea of assimilation, which is very problematic but which are important. The Scottish government has passed a law to say that refugees can vote in Scotland. Now, assimilation legally or technically is about citizenship. And there is no greater proof of citizenship than the ability of you to cast your vote in an election. And to be able to gain a passport and cross borders. And so for me, those two things that are markers for refugees, refugees may be able to gain a travel document, but to be able to vote in the Scottish elections is a very powerful symbol of saying, you're one of us. You are just one of us. When you go into that voting booth and you make your cross, nobody can know what proportion of the vote came from a refugee population. And I think that is one element in which we might return to those concepts of assimilation, or of an idea of places where you can be equally one with others. And I think for me, those are the times of equality, are the times that Victor Turner talks about in anthropology of communitas, as he talks about them. They're the times where much has disintegrated, but we meet as human equals. They are the moments where you help somebody because they've just knocked over their coffee cup. You vote, you sit together and you share a meal because you're all hungry. So those moments that make us particularly as common points of humanity or common points in society, I think those may be ones that are understandable within some of what remains as a residue within that word assimilation.
Thank you, Alison. Do we have one final question then? I know it's just about time, so maybe if we can give one last opportunity, then I wouldn't tire discussing about this issue, but then I'd like to give the final opportunity for one of our guests.
Yes, we do have a final question. Can I just add it? Yeah. So it's from Zoe. She's saying, "Thank you, Alison, for such an inspiring talk. This is not a fully formed question, but I'm wondering how can we use the art as a tool to create better integration policy? Or maybe how can we integrate art and culture more into the policy making process?"
Yeah, I love that question, Zoe. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And it's very much what we've been trying to do within our own team. And that you were doing at the start with music, just to welcome us all. And it's a bit of a battle I'm having at the moment within UNESCO. So normally integration reports and integration work is a policy report, and the art is in the foyer, or it's at the start and the end of a session. And I think what we've been doing with our work, I haven't done it in the middle of this talk, but it's very much trying to intersperse the work we do with poetry, trying to intersperse the work we do with music, with art, with costume, so that we just live it as a thread of life, rather than something that is just for the cinema or the theatre or the institutions of culture. And to me, I think that's one of the ways we can do it, by just not being precious about it, not being frightened of art and culture, but inviting people in to just know when to maybe make a break, or maybe bring a poem, or bring a moment that can interrupt. And certainly when we presented our work on why cultural work with refugees at the European Parliament, I basically said to the civil servants, look, we'll come, we'll do it, but we will only do it if I can be interrupted by my colleague Nardensa, who also makes costumes and is a singer, and that she will interrupt me with singing. So that we get an interruption, a moment of rupture, a moment of decreation, a different voice, a different tone that can interrupt, as Adriana Cavarero says, citing Italo Calvino, that interrupts the din of the realm. The din of the realm is the Gantt chart, the audit committee, the forms, the policy reports, the stuff with numbers after it, the resolution 9.3.2b, that's the din of the realm. That's the thing that makes it all go on. And if we can just slice through it from time to time and interrupt, and let something else come through, the voice of a woman singing, the unexpected melodies of a salsa, Cuban, Eritrean musician, if that can come through, or if you might find that you have the last word from someone giving a seminar actually ends up being a poem, then you start to think about things differently. And maybe on that note, I should give you my last words. So here we go. Just to sum up everything that I've said so far. My name is Alison, and I'm a recovering racist. I was born with this addiction because my ancestors were white, and the country I am from grew fat in every imperial fight. Money, privilege, and power come down the barrel of a gun. That wasn't just in history, it's still how this is done. The work which calls me loudly towards your skins and eyes and tears is the work that is intention to assuage those birthright fears. So do not idolize my actions. Do not praise my words as bold. Do not look at my intentions or the papers that I hold. The thoughts I have of charity are just part of this addiction, inherited from a line that is a long and bleached out fiction. I do not have to worry when my skin is in a room or on a train or in a car or in the immigration tomb. I'll be given space and money and more time because I'm white, because my ancestors were slave drivers or slave owners and right. While you, my friends, my kindred, will be skinned another way, flayed into diminishments through ever greater punishments and all those cruel admonishments. The only proper meaning of a white man's burden is that for all my days, commitment will be to a healing labour. On my deathbed, in my dying, I will be a racist too. But it's shouldering the burden that can lead to something new, not denial of what sticks to every tone or shade or pore, but the making of relationships that brim with something more, something giving and forgiving of the shame upon my skin, something real and raw and honest that can live with history's sin. At times, our conversations will make our skins dissolve, and around us through the laughter, a new world may revolve. When the tears are all that join us, and the skin gives way to bone, and through the pain we'll love again, and call one earth our home.
Thank you very much, Professor Alison, for the insightful presentation talk today. And thank you to everyone for coming and contributing today. I hope you enjoyed the seminar. And I think we can call this a day. And we would like to invite you for our next seminar, which will be on the 26th of January 2021, and we wish you a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and we will see you in 2021. And with that, I think we conclude our today's seminar.